Hey y'all, welcome to the Clock Tower. I'm Colton, and this is a Weiss Schwarz Mono Red Haruhi Suzumiya deck. This is a bit of an older set, doesn't get played a whole lot in the modern meta, and for good reason. The set lacks the efficiency and synergy that you need in modern Weiss, but there are still some good pieces here, and this Mono Red Haruhi deck is good at least for casual play. The goal of the deck is pretty simple. We're trying to set up the free Burn 1 Climax combo at level 3. This is not a particularly competitive deck. Um, Take this to locals, maybe take it to a shop challenge. Anything above that, the deck's not really going to compete. It doesn't have the power, it doesn't have the efficiency, but it's definitely good for casual play, locals play, and this deck also meets the criteria for most waifu tournaments, and if it doesn't, it will with just a few minor changes. It's not a huge investment. You should be able to get this entire deck for less than $100. A couple of cards might not be as available just because it's a older print run, so some things might be a little harder to find, but on the whole, this deck shouldn't cost you that much. This deck is trying to do one thing. It's trying to set up the 3-2 Trouble Girl Haruhi at level 3 that burns 1 for free on attack with the Climax combo. It also heals on play, which can hopefully buy you a little extra time at level 3. This is a railroady roadmap style deck. It does one thing, and the whole deck is built around trying to make that one thing happen. Being a product of an older set, Trouble Girl doesn't have searchable traits, which means it can be difficult to find the synergy necessary in the deck to go and get it. So our goal is to build up as much stock as possible so that we can pay out that expensive setup, and use that stock to find other ways to do little bits of damage that'll get us to our win. Starting at level 0, the goal here is pretty simple. Keep our cards alive, keep our field full so we can build stock, and do as much damage as we can do in the early game. So first, let's talk about a couple of cards at level 0 that have really nice synergy with each other. First is the level 0 Reverser with 1000 power Hot Springs Haruhi, and it helps the 0/0/2000 Primp and Proper Haruhi, which, when it reverses a character, rests and moves another character to the back row. So what we'll do here primarily is attack with the Hot Springs Haruhi first, give that to the Primp and Proper, which can then get the reverse, and then save our Reverser into the back row to keep it alive for another turn. In keeping with our level 0 goal of trying to keep cards on the field as much as possible so that we can consistently build stock. We run 4 of each of those. Next is the 001500 Yuki Nagato. We run 4 of these as well. It's the only blue that we run, but it meshes really well with what the rest of the deck is trying to do. This card gets 2000 power on defense and also has Hand on Core, which means that it stays in the field. It's a great card to have in your opening hand if you go first because it's unlikely to die with 3500 power on defense. And if you don't have the cards in hand to fill your field on your next turn, pitch a card you don't need, keep this in play, keep building that stock. Next, the Flowers in Both Hands Haruhi, plus 500 back row assist. This helps us get our reverses at level 1. It's not as important in the very early part of the game. It has an interesting act ability. On the trigger on our level 3 Climax, we can pay 1 to send one of our opponent's front row level 1 or lower characters to waiting room. This is a nice way to deal with some particularly pesky level 1s, such as standbys or Aaron from Attack on Titan, big standby targets, things like that. Just clears them out, sends them to waiting room, doesn't even pop it back into your opponent's hand. Can be nice, relatively low cost to get something really irritating off the field, disrupt your opponent's level 1 Climax combos. It's a good card that synergizes well with the rest of the deck. Finally, our last level 0, we play 3 of the Super Editor-in-Chief Haruhi, and it's basically here because it has an ability that, as far as I know, is completely unique in Weiss. It has a pay 1 anti-brainstorm ping. When your opponent brainstorms, if they reveal a Climax, you can pay 1 to do 1 damage. It's cheeky, it's petty, and it works. It's a way to get a little bit of extra damage on decks that like to plus, especially in the early game. It also can add power to the Trouble Girl in certain situations. The Trouble Girl has the book trait, and when this card is in play, if one of your book characters becomes reversed, you can add 1000 power to another character. So if it's in your back row at level 3 and you get reversed, you might be able to save a Trouble Girl or maybe get a reverse. But it's not a particularly useful ability. It's not something that I think we need a game plan around. It doesn't have any helpful traits. We can't go look for this. So we just kind of hope that we get it into hand. And that's the unfortunate reality with this deck is that sometimes you have to hope that you get things into your hand just because the traits just aren't there. The deck shows its age in that regard. So, but still, it's a useful card. You'll usually end up with one of these in your hand at some point. You might have to run it in for damage in the early game. But if you can leave this in your back row and ping off a point or 2 of damage from your opponent, it can be useful. So moving into the mid-game, at levels 1 and 2, our goal, once again, keep that full field. We're trying to keep stock up, and we're trying to do as much damage as we can. The most important thing in our mid-game is that we're getting our level 3 pieces into hand. We want 3 Trouble Girls and our Climax. Try to get this combo off because that's what the whole deck is built around. We also have a couple of compression options we're going to try to use when we can. First and foremost, we run 4 of the 1/0/5000 usual Haruhi. This card goes to memory when it gets a reverse and returns to your stage any position from your memory at your draw phase. Ideally, we want to have a full field of these in the early part of our mid-game because they all go to memory on reverse. They're easy to pop back out into the field. It's consistent field and consistent stock generation. It's easy to search this with our 1/1 event that we'll talk about in a second. It also helps if you have some of these in your memory when you refresh. It helps us compress, gets us some better numbers off the refresh. It's also just a really well-designed card. A lot of the cards in this set I think are really well-designed. The flavor in this set is really solid, and I just think this card is really cool. Next up, this is one of the most important cards in the deck. We play 4 of this 1/1 Super Editor-in-Chief Haruhi and the Assistants. The effects on this card are expensive, but we need them to make the deck run, and it does a lot of things that help us get where we want to go. We can rest it and pay 2 to go get the Trouble Girl from the waiting room. Unfortunately, this is the best way to consistently get Trouble Girl into our hand. It's why we're so dependent on stock generation. We can also rest it for free just to give some power pump to our front row. This really helps in the mid game with getting reverses so that we can send our usuals to memory. Also, if we have some extra stock at the end of the game, we can rest and pay 2 to ping for 1. So this card does a lot of things. Again, it's really expensive, but the versatility and consistency that it provides us makes it worth it, especially in a set that really doesn't give us any other options. We can also find it really easily. We can go get it with our 1/1 event because it has the SOS Brigade trait, and it also has a soul trigger to do a little bit of extra damage. This is the 1/1 search event. We run 4 of these, pay 1, pitch 1, and search for 2 SOS Brigade characters. Notably, this does not search for Trouble Girl, which is only traded with Brigade Leader and Book. So we can't go get our finisher with this, but we can get pretty much everything else. We're going to try to fill our front row with the level 1 usuals and find 1 copy of the Assistance utility card. Put that in our back row to help us get our level 3 setup. Our last level 1, we run 2 of these 1/1 Endless 8 events. When we put this card into memory, we give a character 1,000 power for each copy of this card we have in memory. We can play this on our counter step, which is nice. It gives us a little bit of backup in a deck that has no other real backup options. It does a lot of things for us. It helps compress our deck a little bit, helps get our climaxes out of stock, helps usuals get reverses so that they can go to memory if necessary. So this card does a few different things. We won't play it in every game, but in the games it does show up in, it's really useful, and it is worth paying that 1 stock. Probably my favorite thing about this card, though, is the fact that if you're familiar with the series, this card plays into the Endless 8 arc from Season 2. There are 8 different versions of this card. They all have the same card text, but they all have different art. You can also run up to 8 copies of this card in a deck. One of my favorite things about Weiss is how the cards and their mechanics pull from their source material, and this is just one of the finest examples of that. We play a combo at level 2 in this deck, 4 copies of the 2/1 5000 Bamboo Leaf Rhapsody Haruhi, as well as 4 copies of the I Am Here Climax. When we get this combo off, it gives us a free waiting room search on attack, which is obviously fantastic because it lets us go get our Trouble Girl. We would put a lot more emphasis on this combo if we could search for the level 2, but we can't. It has no traits. We can't search for it. So we just kind of have to hope that we get it into hand, which is not an ideal situation, which is why it's not our primary waiting room search. But if we can get it off, it's great. The Climax blind stocks 1 on play, which helps us a lot to get our level 3s into play. It gives us more soul triggers, and the combo triggers on attack, so we don't need to get reverses, which is good because the card is really small, as with the rest of this deck. So this is really useful if we can get it. If we don't get it, it's not our primary method of getting our level 3 setup anyway, but it's nice to have. And then finally we run 1 of the 2/2 8500 SOS Brigade Leader Haruhi. This is really just there in case we can't get to our 3rd Trouble Girl for some reason. It has 2 soul, and we essentially use it as a backup finisher at level 3. It has a climax combo that we don't run, but we can search for this if our Trouble Girls are stuck in our stock or our clock or something. This card can fix potential endgame damage problems, and it also gives us another soul trigger, but having another card that can swing for 2 soul at the endgame can be really helpful in a few different situations, so it just gives us more options. And finally, our level 3. The reason that we play this deck. We try to get a full field of the 3/2 Trouble Girls and burn for the win. We run 4 of the Trouble Girls and 4 of the Someday in the Rain Climaxes. As we said before, the combo burns 1 for free on attack, so if you have 3 Trouble Girls out with the Climax, you're swinging for at least 12 damage on 6 different swings, and you're only paying 6 stock for it. This is going to do a lot of consistent damage. It can win games from level 2, and if you throw in a soul trigger and maybe a ping from the assistants in the back row, and couple that with the on-play heal, and you're looking at a card that can not only push for the win, but can also buy you an extra turn if it doesn't get there. The trigger on the Someday in the Rain helps us get our Trouble Girl, and it also triggers that pay 1 Flowers in Both Hands ability that sends a level 1 to Waiting Room. So the climax itself, even independent of the burn combo, is useful for us throughout the game. This card's not going to get a ton of reverses. It doesn't have any kind of power pump, and there's not a whole lot of extra power to be found in the deck, but it's not really there to get us reverses. It's there to swing for a lot of soul and try to get us a win. So when we look at the way that we want our field to look, in the mid-game, we're trying, in an ideal world, to have 3 usual Haruhis in the front row. If we don't, we can fill one of these lanes with a level 0 that we don't mind swinging in with. These cards are all going to go to memory anyway if we get reverses, so we're not afraid of open lanes. We want to have one of the assistants in the back row so that we can start looking for our Trouble Girls as early as possible. And having the Flowers in both hands lets us play a little bit of defense if we get that gate trigger off. We also would not mind seeing an I Am Here climax early in the game, just because it gives us that blind stock that can help us get our endgame engine going. And that endgame is really straightforward. We're just trying to fill the field with Trouble Girls, keep the assistants in the back because we'd like to have that potential ping ability. If we get the Anti-Brainstormer into hand, we might as well throw it in the back row just because it does give a little bit of power to a Trouble Girl if one of them gets reversed, and it also punishes our opponent for any kind of late game Brainstorm. The best part about this deck is definitely the 3-2 combo. It wins games. It does a lot of damage. It does a lot of consistent damage. It has a high damage floor and can swing for big numbers that can win games from level 2. The high number of 4-ofs and level 0s gives us a lot of consistency. We'll almost always have something to play in our hand, and it's not difficult to get this endgame set up. This is a railroad, roadmap style deck. It does one thing, and the whole deck is built to do that one thing, and it does so pretty consistently. And it also is mostly non-interactive. It isn't as concerned about what your opponent is playing. It does what it does, more or less, regardless of matchup, which is generally a strength. So if you play out the deck, you can usually get your endgame combo set up way more often than not. The deck definitely has a lot of weaknesses, though. First things first, there is no way to get through this deck with any kind of speed. There are no Brainstormers worth playing with this list. If you get a lot of climaxes early, there's no way to get through your deck to get to your refresh. You are only going to refresh one time, and if you don't have good compression on that refresh, you are going to have trouble getting cancels down the stretch. The setup for level 3 is really expensive, and the fact that a lot of our cards don't really have good traits means that setup can be cumbersome and frustrating. That's why we run the assistants. As expensive as it is, it's a consistent, streamlined way to get the Trouble Girls into hand. And finally, the deck just doesn't have a lot of power. Beyond the level 1-0, and the little bit of help that we can give it with the assistance power pump and the Flowers in Both Hands assist and the Endless 8, there's just not a ton of power here. Most of the cards are pretty small, and very few of them will survive into the next turn, which is why it's so important that the Yuki has Hand Encore, that we can send the usuals to memory, that we can save the Reverser with the Primp and Proper at level 0. It's so that we can keep cards in the field because they're not going to survive on their own. Games with this deck tend to play pretty fast. Usually we're going to want to try to swing for game by turn 5 or 6, which means we can follow a little bit of a roadmap with our stock build. If we have about 13 stock generated over the course of the game, we'll usually have enough to do everything we need to get our level 3 into play. Obviously it takes 6 to play a full field of Trouble Girls. Each Waiting Room search with the assistants is a pay 2. We don't want to have to do that more than twice. Especially because we have to pay 1 to get the assistants out of the field, we have to pay 1 for the 1/1 search event, and we also have to pay 1 if we want to put the Bamboo Leaf Rhapsody into play, if we want to send an Endless 8 to memory, or if we want to use the Anti-Brainstorm ping. So we need to have enough stock to do all these things, and it's important that we swing with 3 as many times as possible because we just don't have that many turns to generate the stock that we need. And when we do have extra stock, we have the option to try to convert it into damage. We can use the assistant's ability to ping. We can ping with the Super Editor-in-Chief. We don't want to have any extra stock at the end of the game because we can use it to inflict damage on our opponents and push for game. And of course, as we said, the mid-game is all about finding ways to get the Trouble Girl combo into hand. Aside from the Waiting Room search with the assistants, we do have triggers with Someday in the Rain. The Bamboo Leaf Rhapsody Climax combo does give us a free search on attack, so we can use that, save a stock that way. And if we do draw into a Trouble Girl or a Someday in the Rain climax, we need to hold it, even at turn 1. As much as we want to pitch those things typically in our opening hand, with this deck we need to hold on to them, because as much as it's not ideal to be holding onto those cards and essentially limiting our hand size, those cards are just so difficult to get, especially the Someday in the Rain climax, which we have no way of searching out and we absolutely need for our endgame. The other factor that we pay a lot of attention to in our midgame is our compression and the state of our stock, not just how much stock we have. With a deck that wants to send its own characters into memory, opponents are going to be swinging into open fields, so the best thing we can do is compress our deck as much as we can. We can get some of that compression by sending our usuals and our endless 8s to memory, and also by building up a lot of stock in the midgame. We can get climaxes out of that stock and into waiting room by paying out our assistance abilities, pinging for damage when we can before that refresh in the midgame. There are a couple other things that you can run if you want in this deck. I playtested a lot of these and found that they just weren't as effective, but they are definitely options available to you. The 2-1 Victory Declaration Haruhi has a pay 1 change ability that replaces it with Trouble Girl if it's rested at your Encore step. That effect does save a lot of stock, but in order for it to work, the Trouble Girl either needs to be in the back row or it needs to have a lot more significant backup than we can really give it, because a 10,000 power Trouble Girl is going to get run over by early plays. If your opponent is at level 3, it's not hard to find something that can run over 10,000 power at level 3. So the Trouble Girl doesn't make it back to our turn, usually, if we run this effect. The 0-0 Girl Who Will Change the World does rest a character and give itself 1,000 power, so we can use that if we want to try to rest the Victory Declaration in the back row to try to make this effect work. I find it difficult and clunky to pull off, but it's definitely an option for you. This card is also a decent replacement for the level 0 Yuki Nagato if you need to replace it for a single character waifu tournament build. The Victory Declaration also has a pay 3 Brainstorm that lets you look at the top 3 cards of your deck, and it puts a brigade leader onto the stage with a level that is equal to the number of brigade leaders you reveal on the Brainstorm. In order for this to be effective, we would want to reveal 3 brigade leaders and put a Trouble Girl onto the stage. But it's so hard to run this deck with enough brigade leaders to make that consistent. It's just too big of a whiff risk, because if we miss, we just spent 3 stock and got very little to help us actually set up our endgame. So the Brainstorm in particular is not very helpful. Again, the change effect is potentially usable, but in my playtesting I found it to be more cumbersome and more difficult to use than it was worth. There are a couple of yellow level 0s as well. 0-0 Kyon has an ability that lets us pay 1, send a brigade leader from our stage to the clock, and then search our deck for a usual and put it onto the stage. That's a lot to pay for an early play at level 1, especially the stock pay, just to get a usual out in place so that we can start getting reverses with it and sending it to memory. It just doesn't give us enough for what we're paying, especially considering that at level 1 we can play a 1-1 event that lets us go and search for 2 usuals, or a usual and an assistance. So just not the most efficient use of our stock. There's also a level 0 Brainstormer, Kyon's sister. It's a pay 1 that gives a Kyon character +1 soul for each climax revealed. If you're playing the Kyons, maybe, but there isn't really any reason to play this in this list aside from making the deck run a little bit faster. It's just not worth what you're going to have to pay in stock in order to use this card effectively. There are more options for assists and backups in this deck as well. I like the Endless 8 because it compresses in addition to giving power. The rest of the assists and backups in this set either are not worth it in terms of stock, or they're off color. There are a couple of options if you want to look into them. There's a 1-2 that gives 1,000 power to everything in front of it. There is a 1-1 that gives 2,000 power. But realistically, the set is just so small, it's not worth it to put a lot of resources into things like assists and backups, because the power level of this set is just too small for it to really win a lot of battles head-to-head in the front row. This 2-0 counter event is really interesting to me. I tried to run it and I wasn't really able to make it work, but it's definitely worth considering. It bounces climaxes from the field into your opponent's waiting room as a free counter event. This card can win games. It will potentially save our Trouble Girls. It stops our opponents from pulling off their level 3 combos, keeps us from eating a lot of damage. It's a really powerful card. It's really hard to pull off in this list because it's off color and we can't go search for it. So we need to just get it into our hand at the right time, or we need to hold it, and we're already holding so many cards in our hand to make our level 3 combo work. I wasn't able to make it synergize effectively, but it's definitely worth at least a look if you want to play this list, because of what it can do in the endgame, maybe as just a one of. It's worth considering. There's also the Happy Valentine Haruhi combo at level 1, which gives us a waiting room search on reverse. The biggest issue with this card is that it's just not searchable. It's not traded in a way that lets us go get it with the 1/1 event, which would mean that we'd have to just pull it or hold it, as well as its climax combo. I would rather run the Bamboo Leaf Rhapsody just because it's the same price, it's just as easy or difficult to get into hand, and it has the better climax combo. What this one does, it gives one of your characters waiting room search on reverse. So ideally you would give it to a usual, which at least one of them is supposed to get a reverse anyway, but you still need the reverse in order to use the waiting room search. Bamboo Leaf Rhapsody searchability happens only on attack, and it also has the better climax because we can blind stock with that climax. This is just a 2-soul. So it's easier to pull off the effect with the Bamboo Leaf Rhapsody combo, and its climax also gives us something that we really need, which is additional stock. So this combo isn't bad. If it were searchable, or it was a 1/0, then I think it would be worth a longer look. But given that we have to pay one, we can't search for it, and it requires a reverse, I think the Bamboo Leaf Rhapsody is just a better combo. So this is the list, as well as prices from either JKTCG or TCG player as of when this video went up. The most expensive card in the set is definitely the Hot Springs Haruhi. It runs about $32 for a play set. That's also one of the more difficult cards to get a hold of. Same with the usual Haruhi. Playset for that usually runs around $20, but it kind of fluctuates depending on where you can find it. Sometimes you can find playsets on JKTCG. Other times you have to go kind of all over the place. eBay, individual store websites. Sometimes Strictly Broken will have what you're looking for. The Yuki Nagatos are also a little bit more expensive, but typically a little bit easier to find. Some of these cards are available in the trial deck. You can get the Flowers of Both Hands Haruhi in the trial deck, as well as 2 Trouble Girls and all 4 of your Someday in the Rains. There are a few other pieces in the trial deck as well that we talked about when we were talking about other options, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend the trial deck if this is the deck you're trying to build, but you can usually get the trial deck for like $15. It's not super in demand. They're typically pretty available, so it might be worth it if you're trying to get more pieces, but if you're trying to build this list, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But overall, the deck comes to about $90. With shipping and taxes, you're probably looking at about $100 in total for this deck. So if you're a Haruhi fan, or you're looking for something fun and different to take to locals that you haven't played before, that a lot of people maybe haven't seen in a long time, this deck is fun, it's consistent, and it gets wins against good decks. I think it's worth playing. I'm having a lot of fun with it, and I think that it's definitely a better list than I think a lot of people are going to give it credit for. Well, that's it for that. Thank you very much. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Share this video with anyone that you think might be interested in it. Check out the website, clocktowerweiss.wordpress.com. And check out our other videos. Brandon has a SAO standby deck video. We're working on a lot of other projects, planning on releasing more in the coming weeks. So thank you very much. This is the Clock Tower.